Welcome everyone to this online event of the Muslim Society's Global Perspectives Project at Queen's University. My name is Adnan Hussain. I teach in the history department and I'm director of the School of Religion, and I direct the Muslim Society's Global Perspectives Project. I hope you are aware of our various events that we've held in Islamic History Month. We've had a number of online events, and we will continue to do so during this year, starting next term in January. This will be the last online event of this term, but do connect with us so that you can stay apprised of upcoming events that I think you'll find very interesting. So you can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/MSGPQU, the same at Twitter, /MSGPQU. And I also want to encourage you to listen to the podcast that MSGP has organized called The Majlis, which comes out about twice a month, and you can find anchor.fm/the-majlis. And an upcoming episode will feature our speaker today in conversation with me and Dr. Ariel Salzman, to whom I'd like to turn over proceedings to introduce our distinguished lecturer. Ariel, take it away.
Okay, thank you, and welcome everybody. I'm happy to be presenting and have our guest with us for this podcast, for this Majlis. Actually, we're live. And I'm very, very happy that Professor Elizabeth F. Thompson is with us today. She holds a chair in Islamic Peace Studies at American University, but that's her current position. She formerly was in the Department of History at the University of Virginia and taught also in Berkeley. Elizabeth is the author, Professor Thompson is the author of several books, articles, and the first two books, the first book won several awards, and that book was, forgive me, Libby, your titles are very long, Colonial Citizens, Republican Rights, Paternal Privilege, and Gender in French Syria. Her second book was Justice Interrupted, The Struggle for Constitutional Government in the Middle East, and that received funding from the Carnegie Foundation, among others, to support that project. It's a book that deserves very wide attention, and we're hoping for Harvard to put it out in paperback so we can use it more easily in our classes. It covers a very large span of history, starting from the 16th century forward to the Arab Spring, to 2011. Her third book is the topic of her talk today, and that book I have with me right now. How the West Stole Democracy from the Arabs, the Syrian Arab Congress of 1920, and the destruction of its historic liberal Islamic alliance. Like all of Libby's books, these are really well written. I have to say, I'm a historian who has the habit of writing very turgidly, and by contrast, Elizabeth Thompson writes beautifully and engagingly. This is a page turner. So while some might steer away from history, this is a book that must be read and will be enjoyed as a work of history, but also of high literary quality. And in this particular case, our guest is also a longtime friend of mine, and I was with her as she diligently researched this book, which took her to many, many places, and you'll see the sources. Professor Thompson considers herself an historian of social movements, of race and gender, but she's also a preeminent transnational historian, as this book demonstrates. So without further commentary, I'd like to welcome Professor Thompson to deliver a talk today.
Thank you so much, Ariel, and thank you, Adnan, for inviting me. It's such a pleasure to see old friends from Queens and up in Canada. One day I'll be able to travel again and see you in person. I'm going to share a screen. I have a few slides. I hope this is going to work. I'm not sure. I didn't set up my slides I'm going to have to backtrack a little bit, but pardon me. There we go. And all right, do you all see that title card? Is that evident? I hope so. Just to introduce, I think we should begin today by remembering that half of Syrians are starving. Millions today go to bed every night with no food in their stomachs, and many with no roofs over their heads. And now they are facing the COVID pandemic without the protection of a government or any other public body. Is it, you might ask, I ask myself, a luxury to speak of democracy during pandemic and famine? I answer no. As the economist Amartya Sen long ago argued, famines are man-made things, and they occur under dictatorships, not generally under democracies. It is therefore imperative that we examine why Syria has lost its long-time democratic culture, and how then, from that knowledge, we might imagine how to restore it and its people to health. My research concerns the period following another pandemic, the Spanish flu 100 years ago. After 4 years of World War I and the death of nearly 500,000 people in Greater Syria, and here I'm showing you only part of Greater Syria on this map. This is a map of the recent civil war. It's a little bit outdated by this point, but it gives you the point that it is a much divided and defunct society in many ways. But Greater Syria back in the day, 100 years ago, would have included the current state of Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Israel-Palestine. Okay, these are peoples who thought of themselves as living in what in Arabic they call Bilad al-Sham. And they gathered, their leaders anyway, their political leaders gathered in Damascus, down here, to build a new state that would protect the welfare of their people better than the Ottoman Turks had done during the Great War. Now, I began this project in the summer of 2013, wow, 7 years ago. I was writing an article on Syria after the First World War for a conference at Princeton, and two things struck me. First, I was surprised to discover, as I began to write, that the president of the Syrian Congress in 1920 was a very religious man named Sheikh Rashid Riddha. He led the drafting of a constitution that is, for me, the most democratic in the Arab world to date, to today, including, I would argue, more democratic than the current, hardly, difficult, years in the making Tunisian constitution following the Arab Spring. Let's put it that way. And it is democratic in part, or saliently so, because religion was separated from the state. The second thing that struck me as I was writing my article in 2013 were some events that were taking place in Egypt, the country where Rashid Riddha spent most of his life in exile. In August 2013, I watched the Arab Spring in Egypt come to an end with the massacre of 400 members of the Muslim Brotherhood by the security state and military regime that Egyptians had risen up against only 2 years before. In 2011, the democratic revolution against Hosni Mubarak's dictatorship had begun with the union of secular liberals and Muslim brothers in Tahrir Square. But in 2013, the liberals turned against the president-elect, Mohamed Morsi, who was a leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, and they supported instead the coup by General Sisi, who installed a harsher dictatorship than before. I wondered, how is it that a coalition between liberals and Islamists was so successful in 1920, but that this same sort of coalition failed so terribly a century later? I therefore wrote the book to explain the success and the destruction of the democratic coalition of Islamists and liberals in 1920. I believe the history of that time is an important factor in the current weakness of democracy in the Arab world today. Sorry, I didn't show you this picture. Here's Rashid Riddha, and here's a picture of Muslim brothers in Tahrir Square in Cairo. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire in the First World War presented an opportunity to build an independent Arab state in 1918. In October of that year, Prince Faisal, son of, let's look at the map again just to orient us. This is in French, I apologize, but he's son of the Sharif of Mecca here, and he had led the Northern Arab Army in concert with British troops northward to defeat the Ottomans at Damascus on October 1st, 1918. Several days later, Prince Faisal proclaimed this Syrian state to govern the territory of Greater Syria, including Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Palestine, and present-day Israel. And he proclaimed that state to be a constitutional monarchy where all Arabs, Muslim or not, would enjoy rights. You may ask me, and this could be something to address in the question and answer, I asked the same question, did the designation of an Syrian Arab kingdom, was that an exclusionary gesture? Was that to exclude non-Arabs in the territory? The best I was able to ascertain in the minds of the leaders at Damascus was this. The large percentage of Kurds living in northeastern Syria today were not living there at that time. And so there was not an effort to exclude them in a way that later the Ba'athist regime in Syria would exclude Kurds under its current regime. Okay. Second, the Armenians, who were living, tens of thousands of them, in Damascus, in Aleppo, in Lebanon, in camps, were clamoring to go home to their homelands in Anatolia at that moment. And so I don't think designating the Syrian Arab Kingdom had an exclusionary intention. Just as a side note. Back to Faisal in 1918 and to our next picture. Faisal demanded recognition of this independent state at Paris in a meeting with the Supreme Council of the Peace Conference. The prince's speech so impressed Woodrow Wilson that the American president actively defended Syrians' right to self-determination against British and French claims made in their secret and infamous Sykes-Picot Treaty, which planned to slice up Greater Syria between them. So in February 1919, Wilson presented the Covenant of the New League of Nations to the world. Article 22 of that covenant guaranteed recognition of the provisional independence of Syria under a temporary mandate, meaning like a kind of license to rule, that would be issued by the League and overseen by the League, just to allow peoples who seem not quite organized well enough, ready for self-government, to put together a government and then rule for themselves. That was the spirit that Woodrow Wilson accepted the idea of a mandate over Syria in February of 1919. He had mused on his ship crossing the Atlantic in December of 1918 about who the ideal mandatory powers would be, who would sort of help Syrians pull together their government and then grant them their independence, right? And he had told his advisors that he thought ideally it would be a Scandinavian country that would not have the resources to colonize Syria, and that the League should give the Scandinavian country the resources to temporarily to help Syrians, guide them in setting up the various ministries and so on, organizing fully a bureaucracy and an army and so on. He was very scared that the British or the French, who had made it what quite known in the Sykes-Picot Treaty, that they intended to colonize Syria. He was quite concerned that they might do so. Okay, so that is the spirit in which Article 22 was issued. That is not the spirit under which it would be enforced, as we will see in a few minutes. Okay. To buttress his position, Wilson then, in March of 1919, authorized an American Commission of Inquiry to survey Syrians on their preferences concerning the mandate. So back in Syria, upon Faisal's return to the country in May, elections were held for a representative Congress that would meet that American Commission. If you look at the poster, I hope you can see my cursor here. Here's Faisal, all right, who at this point is the delegate of his father, the Sharif of Mecca, the caretaker of a temporary government, and soon to be proclaimed king of Syria by the Congress, right? But what's interesting about this poster, created in the spring of 1920, is how it represents the various interests that came together in the Congress. The Congress was elected under former Ottoman law, electoral laws. Many of these people had served in an Ottoman parliament before World War I. They represented districts that had been organized under the Ottomans in an era when constitutional government had become the norm. But what we see is, here's Rashid Riddha, the man who would soon become the president of the Congress, and he is wearing a sort of turban of the style of a man of religion. And we see several men of that background, some of them quite prominent in Syria. We also see men wearing a tarbouch. Okay, this is Hashim Atassi, very prominent former bureaucrat, sub-governor in various provinces of the Ottoman Empire, comes from an eminent family in the city of Homs in Syria. He's wearing a tarbouch. That is the signal of a man who has been a civil servant and is kind of a secularized legal professional, if you will, in the empire. We also see men from the countryside wearing scarves, denoting a kind of tribal or Bedouin background. And then we see some with no hats at all. And this is not an accident. It's not like they forgot their tarbouch that day. They were self-styled young nationalists. They had formed a group called the Arab Youth, or Fatat al-Arab. And many of them had law degrees from Europe and were the drivers behind the Arab revolt that had brought Faisal and his army to Syria in the first place. We can conclude from this visual evidence that the Syrian Congress was not a theater of puppets controlled by Faisal or by the secret society Fatat, which had been formed in the late Ottoman period when the Ottomans began to impose a much more military-style governance over Syria. The Congress represented many different interests in Syrian society, rural and urban, conservative and reformist, religious and secular. All right. It did not represent a sort of Potemkin facsimile of a false democratic representation, which the French would claim, nor did it represent the sort of plaything of Faisal. Indeed, many of the men you see in the picture here opposed Faisal vehemently on many occasions, including, as we'll see at certain points, Rashid Riddha. So anyway, in the summer of 1919, this is a picture from 1920, but the Congress was elected in June of 1919. And at the end of June and early July, they met with the delegates, the American delegates of the famous King Crane Commission sent by President Wilson. The deputies demanded of them, first of all, full independence for Syria. No mandates. We're ready to rule ourselves. We had been citizens of the Ottoman Empire. We had participated at many levels of Ottoman government. We know how to rule ourselves, right? But if Paris would not accept full independence for Syria, the deputies preferred a minimalist American mandate because they believed Americans had no colonial interests in the region, okay? And they insisted that it would be a brief period of guidance by advisors chosen by the Syrians themselves. In all cases, the Congress refused a French mandate because they knew that France intended to colonize Syria. However, back in Washington, the United States Senate voted that fall of 1919 to refuse ratification of the Versailles Treaty and therefore refuse participation in the League of Nations at all. Abandoned by the Americans, it was then in March of 1920 that the Congress declared independence of Syria unilaterally without recourse to the peace conference in Paris. But lawyers like Hashim Atassi pointed out, in the spirit of Article 22 of the League of Nations Covenant, which had granted them provisional independence. Immediately after declaring independence, the Congress began to draft a Syrian constitution. The deputies gathered in this building in the central square of Damascus. It's still there, by the way, from the end of March to July 1920. In my opinion, the constitution they wrote was a true political contract between the representatives of the people elected to the Congress, much like the American Constitution had been written by representatives sent to Philadelphia in 1787. The Congress voted to accept a full draft of the Constitution on July 5th, 1920. By July 19th, 2 weeks later, the deputies had formally ratified the first 6 of 147 articles. So what they did was accept the draft in principle and then go article by article. Oh, should we tweak this word, tweak that word? In fact, they took out one article so that the end product was 147 articles, not 148, as they started out with. Article 1 of the Constitution established a civil regime in the form of a representative monarchy with the capital at Damascus. The article also established Islam as the religion of the king. This article remains, interestingly, in modified form in Syria's constitution today, which requires that the president be Muslim. But let us pause for a moment to consider the language of Article 1. Only after reading the entire Constitution can we fully understand the importance of this article. It does not establish Islam as the religion of the state, as the Ottoman Constitution of 1909 had done. 8 years before Mustafa Kemal Atatürk disestablished Islam in the Republic of Turkey, the Syrians did so in 1920. You will not find that in your standard Middle East history books. And while the king of Syria was to be a Muslim, he did not, in fact, swear to uphold Islamic law, which many presidents and kings of Arab states today do. Article 6 of the Constitution, which was fully ratified, required the king to, quote, swear before the Congress an oath of respect for divine laws and of loyalty to the nation and adherence to the Constitution. No article in the 1920 Constitution requires that legislation be based on Islamic law. Virtually every Arab constitution requires that today. Right? So one important takeaway for us as we consider the state of democracy and the relationship of Islam to democracy in today's Arab world is to note that the current relationship is a very recent invention since the 1950s, to be exact, and is not a historical holdover from the Ottoman Empire. More surprising to me as I studied was that I found the Congress had disestablished Islam under the presidency of the man I've introduced to you, Sheikh Rashid Riddha, who published an Islamic magazine. You can see a cover page of it here, called Al-Manar, the Lighthouse, which was read by Muslims living from Morocco all the way to Indonesia. Okay, he published it from the turn of the 20th century until his death in 1935. Out of Cairo, where he lived in exile, the Ottoman Sultan had found him to be a problematic proponent of democracy even back then. Now, why would a man of religion ratify such a constitution that disestablishes Islam? It's a good question. I don't have full evidence. The French destroyed much of the documentation belonging to the Congress when they came in, but I've been able to piece together the following theory. In an article that he wrote later in his magazine, Riddha explained that equality is a fundamental principle of Islamic governance. to make Islam the foundation of the government in Syria, would violate that principle, he argued, because non-Muslim citizens of Syria would therefore be rendered unequal before the law. A second point that Riddha made in his writings is that religious law should be limited to religious matters, not extended to all areas of public interest. This is in contrast with the teachings of, as we'll see at the end of this lecture, one of his students, Hassan al-Banna, who founded the Muslim Brotherhood and declared that Islamic law should cover all aspects of life. All right? He was running right up against his better trained and more famous mentor, Rashid Riddha. I further discovered that Riddha played a key role in negotiating a compromise on this point in Article 1, in which there had been in March of 1920 a huge debate between religious conservatives who preferred Islam to be the state religion and liberals who preferred to separate religion and state. Under that compromise, the two parties agreed that the king, not the state, should be a Muslim. Riddha argued in trying to forge that compromise in March 1920 that if the new fledgling Syrian state disestablished all of Islam and called for a secular leader, that they might face a popular uprising. That Syrians, as good Ottomans for 400 years, were used to living under a sultan who was also a caliph, leader of Islam, and that such a sudden break would be a shock. And that seemed to persuade the secularly minded guys without the tarbooshes to go along with a compromise that satisfied the conservatives in the Congress. The democratic spirit of the Constitution was further expressed in subsequent articles, which contained a comprehensive list of democratic rights to freedom of belief and speech and assembly, privacy and secure property, and a free public education. The Constitution also ensured that government would be run as a democracy. Sovereignty, it established, lay with the people, and Congress elected Faisal as Syria's first king. Faisal did not rule by dynastic or divine right. Furthermore, the prime minister was responsible to the Congress, not to the king. So these separations of powers were important deviation from the much more executively or monarchical constitution of the Ottomans that came before. Furthermore, the Constitution extended the right to vote to all Syrians aged 20 years old or older without any property qualifications. Again, extending the franchise far beyond that of the Ottomans. However, the article on suffrage, Article number 78, caused the most explosive conflict in the Congress that spring. You'll see on the left of the screen a commemorative stamp of Nazik Alabit. She is recalled by Syrians today as a feminist and an educator who actually fought in Faisal's army. She headed up a sort of equivalent of a Red Cross brigade of nurses on the battlefield, all right, and had organized women during the period of the Syrian Arab Kingdom. And so she had led in late April 1920 a group of women, which included also the very well-known Anbar Salam of Beirut, to petition the Congress to grant educated women the right to vote. They reasoned, they all published magazines as part of their movement, and they reasoned, hey, we served our country during the war, opening soup kitchens and schools for children and offering support to men in battle. And just like British and American women who were getting the vote, we should get the vote too. According to Congress Secretary Izzat Darwazeh, you see him here in this photo, a majority of deputies in the Syrian Congress in April of 1920 supported the women's petition. They claimed that Islam demanded the equality of all believers, not only regardless of religion, but regardless of sex. However, the opposition in the Congress claimed that Islam prohibited women's vote because they had no independent conscience, they claimed, and because Islam required that they obey their husbands and fathers, and therefore could not have an autonomous, independent opinion. Suspiciously, this is an opinion that was voiced very much like the opponents of women's suffrage in France at the time. So you do have to wonder whether the opposition came straight out of Islamic teaching or not. Anyway, fevers ran to such a high pitch that 6 deputies, all religious conservatives, stormed out of the Congress chamber. The Congress was in danger of splitting. Sheikh Rashid Riddha stood up at that moment to strike another compromise. And people clapped as he stood up. He was one of their eminent members. He was not yet the president of the Congress. Right? He was just a deputy from Tripoli, Lebanon. Riddha said that both sides were wrong. Women's suffrage has nothing to do with Islam, he said. It is a matter of the secular public interest. And so, in the public interest, given that France was threatening to invade Syria, given that there were vehement opponents who were willing to rally street demonstrations against women's suffrage should be set aside and decided on later. The imperative in public interest was for unity right now. Congress deputies agreed and voted to postpone a decision on the women's vote. Article 78 simply grants Syrians, not Syrian men, but just Syrians, the right to vote. A week later, the reunited Congress elected Rashid Riddha as its president. And so Riddha can be seen as the kind of linchpin, I think, in the alliance, the Islamic Liberal Alliance that I'm talking about in my book. Meanwhile, the European leaders of the Paris Peace Conference rejected the Syrian Congress's claim to independence, rejected, in fact, the authority of the Congress at all, and also rejected the choice of Faisal as king. The Supreme Council of the Congress consequently met at the end of April, right a day or two after the women's suffrage debate, in San Remo, Italy, at a very fancy resort hotel pictured here. Their business that day was to divide Greater Syria into mandates. If we look at the slide, I have some arrows here. We see under the above the red arrow, the Prime Minister of France, Alexandre Mitterrand, the Prime Minister of England, David Lloyd George. We see the Italian Prime Minister presiding over the conference and Japanese delegates. Now, by rights, the Arabs were still members and participants in the Paris Peace Conference. Sharif Hussein ruled an independent state in Arabia. Faisal had, on that basis, made representations to this same council back in February of 1919 and won the Article 22 promising provisional independence. So it is fair to ask, as historians, where are the Arabs in this room? They're not there. They were not invited. It was insisted that only Faisal could represent the Arabs. But Faisal wisely, he was told by the Congress, stayed in Syria. He feared his kidnap or arrest or some other nefarious business should he leave the territory of Syria. And he had instead sent his closest personal assistant holding down the Arab office in Paris, a man named Rustam Haidar, and with him a man named Nouri Saeed, who would later become a leader in Iraqi politics. And they took a train down to San Remo. I presume they're on the other side of the door, okay, not permitted in the room. Indeed, Lord Curzon here, the foreign minister of Britain, left a rather snarky memo about these pesky Arabs and what are they doing showing up here. So we know that the exclusion was quite purposeful. Inside that room, then, without the Arabs, the men proceeded to divide Syria between the British and the French. France would get the blue areas here, Lebanon, split into Lebanon and Syria, and Britain would govern the southern half of Greater Syria, named for the time being Palestine, and later split into what became Transjordan, or today's Jordan, as well as Iraq. Now, in the Arab scheme of things, Iraq would have been a sister state in a federation of Greater Syria, Iraq, and Arabia, where Sharif Hussein was, right? But now they've been preempted in that vision by the decision at San Remo in April of 1920. Now, the British claimed all of Iraq, including this shaded northern area, precisely because, I use this map because this is supposed to be an oil derrick. They were quite interested in getting control of that petroleum. And indeed, I theorize, and I'm not alone in doing so, that the whole project of dividing Syria into mandates was a product of the demand for oil. The Allies had run short of oil during World War I. They fully expected, correctly so, unfortunately, a Second World War to come, and they needed to secure reliable sources of petroleum for the coming war. And so throughout all the talks on the status of these Arab countries, the prime ministers of Britain and France were always talking about who gets the oil, how will they divide up the oil, and all throughout Britain demanded full control, not only of Iraq, but also of Palestine here. And as you can see, and as I can see, and as the French colonial lobby would see, looking at this map, hey, wait a second, Britain's getting the larger share of territory. That's not fair. We want our equal spoils and so on. And this is absolutely the spirit of the correspondence that exists to this day in diplomatic archives, right? So the reason Syria fell under France ultimately was because France demanded payback for Britain's grab for oil. Okay, and so it had nothing to do truly with any serious measure of whether Syrians were capable of ruling themselves or not. All right, the mandates were a land grab, as Lloyd George's own descendants have admitted. Okay, here is Alexandre Millerand, the French premier, and a copy of a letter from July 20th, 1920, in which he justified invading Syria. Now, under no circumstances did Woodrow Wilson or anybody who participated in the writing of the Article 22 of the League of Nations envision that the mandate should be imposed by force. The language is all about choosing, in the spirit of self-determination, allowing the Syrians to choose their mandatory. That was why the King Crane Commission had gone to poll their opinions. So here we come a year after King Crane to the point where France is going to, at the point of a gun, impose this mandate. Hardly the spirit of the League Covenant. He began planning the invasion immediately after San Remo. Okay, and he justified it ultimately in this letter by claiming that the Syrian Congress was illegal and that their demands for independence and democratic government were, quote unquote, extremist. Right? So in the worldview of Paris leaders of 1920, democracy was a rather extreme form of politics. Here is the French army assembling before invading Syria in July 1920. The Syrian army was very weak because France and the United Kingdom had prohibited the import and purchase of arms to Syria since October 1918. As a result, the army was quickly defeated at Maysalun, just outside of Damascus, on the morning of July 24th, 1920. Most of the Congress deputies who were still in Damascus fled to Jordan, Palestine, Egypt, and Iraq. Faisal himself sought exile in Italy. The invasion ended democratic politics in Syria. By establishing their mandates by force, France and Britain laid the foundations for dictatorship in the Eastern Arab world. In conclusion, I'd like to say a little bit about I'd like to say a little bit about how I see how difficult it was to rebuild that coalition forged in 1920 between liberals and Islamists. Here we have Faisal sitting on a throne, not in Syria, but in Iraq, okay, a year later. The British felt bad about breaking their promise of independence to Faisal and his father, Sharif Hussein. In reality, of course, the oil deal had always been more important to them than their promises. But as a consolation prize, they crowned Faisal king of Iraq in 1921. Faisal blamed the fall of Syria on the Congress. Okay, he felt that the Congress should have negotiated more with the French and given him a freer hand to do so. And so he was therefore content in Iraq to ensure that he could govern in a rather undemocratic manner with a very weak parliament. The coalition of the Democratic Coalition of Damascus would not be replicated in Baghdad. Here's a picture of Riddha in his later years, gained a little weight. If you read his diary, he's always counting the number of kilos he's gained every month to his dismay. Exiled in Egypt, he turned against his former liberal allies. When his appeals to the League of Nations to overturn the French mandate failed, he understood that Europe would never grant rights to Muslims. He therefore taught his students in Cairo and his readers of his magazine Al-Manar to seek justice within Islam against the West. He had been before then, preached quite a different message, that the basic principles of governance within Islam are similar to the liberal principles in Europe. But he had, after 1922, concluded that there were no true liberals left in Europe. Okay. Unlike Riddha, though, his student Hassan al-Banna founded the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928 on a very different basis, not on the principles that Rashid Riddha had upheld at Damascus in 1920, but rather by preaching that a state must be based on Islamic law. So the Islamists, trained and inspired by the Muslim Brotherhood, would harden into an anti-liberal, anti-Western coalition, less inclined to strike the kind of compromises that had been struck in Damascus in 1920. And finally, here we can see an older Hashim Atassi, the man he was the first president of the Congress, and he would become prime minister under Faisal in 1920, opening a parliament now in the Syrian mandate in 1936. By that point, the Islamo-liberal coalition in Syria had long disappeared. He belonged to Tarbush-wearing secular elites who had proclaimed and rewritten the constitution to become a republic in 1928. They had therefore excited opposition by populist Islamic movements, now headed by this man in the late 1930s, Kamal al-Qassab. A word about Kamal al-Qassab. I know we're running late, but I think this helps to clarify how politics had changed in the intervening 15 years. Qassab had organized probably the largest popular movement for independence in Damascus, reaching into the leadership of the different neighborhoods, uniting with popular leaders from other cities in Syria, and demanding independence against conservative elites. He threw his full weight behind Rashid Riddha and the Congress, and therefore behind the Islamo-liberal coalition of 1920. He spent his years of exile not in Egypt like Riddha, but in Saudi Arabia, where he became an advisor to Ibn Saud, and where he became extremely rigid and conservative as a Muslim. When he returned in the late 1930s to Syria, after a 1936 treaty with France, he headed up the Islamic opposition against Hashim Atassi and he would bring down the National Bloc government in 1939. So there was no Islamo liberal coalition operating in Syria by the late 1930s. The destruction of the Arab democratic regime at Damascus in 1920 influenced politics in the other mandates in Egypt and in Arabia, where exiles took up residence and built new political movements in the interwar period. They carried with them bitter memories of the ways in which the West, the language they used, language we can say is, well, I did have the argument with my editor, should we really call my book How the West Destroyed Democracy and stole democracy from the Arabs? But that was the language of the period. And they took that bitter experience with the false promises of the West with them. The cleavage between liberals and Islamists deepened in Syria and Egypt after the Second World War and after independence. The paradox is down to today that secular military dictators have adopted constitutions that enshrine Islam as the official religion and as a source of legislation, as a way of appeasing and quieting opposition. The division between liberals and Islamists has therefore weakened opposition to dictatorship throughout the Eastern Arab world. That division persisted through the 2011 uprisings, which only temporarily seemed to bring together Islamists and liberals in Tahrir Square and elsewhere. And it tragically reappeared afterward. From a historical point of view, then, the future of democracy in Syria depends on repairing this century-old cleavage, or at least this lie that Islam and its principles are opposed to democratic and liberal government, or that democratic and liberal government is necessarily a Western form of government. Was Riddha did not believe so in 1920. It is then important as historians to educate the next generation of activists that the cleavage that weakens their efforts to mobilize against dictatorship is based on contingent political choices made by political leaders in the wake of another pandemic in 1920 and not essential to their future politics. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Libby. I have a question to begin with, because I know when you started talking, you're saying how this chapter is missing from Middle East history. But isn't it also missing from World War I history and the histories that are told about Versailles, Margaret Macmillan, Eretz Manola, and all these other people who claim to write, you know, a sort of transnational history, but yet this dimension is not there?
No. And we still produce, you know, international history is still the child of the old sort of European and American historians. And but I am encouraged that I participated as an editor for an online encyclopedia, which I encourage everyone to look at if they're interested in World War I. It's called 1914-1918 Online. It was edited out of Free University in Berlin. And in the forefront, their goal was to make World War I truly the global war it was, and to bring in the stories from not only the Middle East, but the large numbers of Chinese, Indo-Chinese, of course, the story of the Japanese during World War I, and most importantly, the story of the ultimate backbone of the Allied armies, the African troops who were forcibly recruited to fight against the Germans as well. So I think that I do believe that, and that we have shifted the center of gravity somewhat in the study of World War I. But you know, my book is like on the leading edge of what I hope will be a trend.
Okay, we've opened up the you know, the arena to the forum to questions, and I believe we have one. Our assistant here, Gabrielle Castillo, is posting them when they come on to Facebook and transferring them over to the chat on Zoom. Tasneem asks, why was Riddha exiled?
Excellent. Good question. Thank you. I like talking about Rashid Riddha. Spent a long time studying him. So Rashid Riddha grew up in the coastal Syria. It was called, and under the Ottomans, right? And Tripoli, and grew very interested in the efforts of Jamaluddin al-Afghani and Muhammad Abdu, reformers, Islamic reformers of the late 19th century, in organizing people against autocratic rule. The Ottoman Sultan, being an autocrat, did not take kindly to such political views. And so Riddha in 1897 made his way over to Egypt, which was occupied by the British at the moment. And it is there that he started his magazine under the aegis of his mentor, the great Mufti, Muhammad Abdu. All right. So he was already in exile in Cairo, and when World War I broke out, but during that war, and even earlier, during the period of the Constitutional Revolution, he began agitating for Syrian rights within the Ottoman Empire, and joined something called the Decentralization Party, which I think would be better translated perhaps in English, particularly for Americans who are familiar with the language of federal government, right? That they wanted a federal party. In fact, it's quite astonishing. Members of Fatah, with whom Rashid Riddha organized, were reading Woodrow Wilson's political textbook written before World War I. There were copies found in Syria after the war, and were fascinated by the idea that you could have states within the Ottoman Empire that would keep some of the resources at home and have sort of democratic governance of, say, Syria or Iraq or other places, but they were not seeking secession from the Ottoman Empire. All right, they were seeking only a more federal form of government. For that, though, many had to seek refuge after the coup of 1913. So Riddha remained in Egypt. And its decentralization party aligned with Fatah, the Arab Nationalist Youth Party, to form then what they called the Syrian Union Party during World War I, shifting their demands to autonomy and independence for Syria. All right, so there was much work done before Faisal even arrived in Damascus, and envisioning what kind of government there would be. The first draft of the Constitution was actually written in Cairo and was smuggled in. The British would not let the Syrian exiles in Cairo. There were hundreds, even thousands of Syrians living in Cairo during World War I. And the British wouldn't let them in for almost a year. Riddha, writes in his diary painfully of how he knows so many people in his village in Lebanon had suffered and starved during the war, and he wanted to send clothing to them and so on, and he couldn't. He didn't get there till September of 1919, almost a year after the war had ended, right? So anyway, long story short, it was natural that he would then, after the French invasion, return to Cairo, where he had family and where he had his magazine published.
So we have some more questions. Saeed asks, was similar democracy stealing done in other parts of the Arab world, as well as what is now Saudi Arabia?
Yeah. Well, that has not yet been as fully studied as I've studied for Damascus. I mean, since the Greater Syria was, the politics for Greater Syria was focused on Damascus, I suppose. You can say I've covered all those countries, but I will say that the fight to retain rights continued after the mandates were imposed, but now separately. In Lebanon, separate from Syria, separate from Palestine. And we know that there were efforts to restore or enlarge democratic rights in each of the separate mandates, as well as in Iraq separately. I would not go as far as to say that democracy was stolen in Arabia, because there was no democracy Arabia had never really been governed directly from Istanbul. It had always been kind of farmed out to particularly religious tribal leaders like Sharif Hussein, and therefore not participated as closely in the sort of transformation of politics into a more constitutional democratic mode that had occurred up in Anatolia and Syria. So I wouldn't go that far to say. Just a footnote to that, the first constitution written in Arabic is conventionally considered to be that written in Tunisia, right, in the 1860s. So in that sense, since the French also occupied Tunisia, we might use that verb, stealing democracy, as well. But again, there was no other country that had as democratic a constitution as that written at Damascus in 1920.
So we have a question from Sean. Would you be able to expand upon the relationship between the Syrian Congress and the Ottoman Turkish state? And by this, he probably means the occupied government in Istanbul, perhaps, and what would become the end of the Young Turks and Kemalist movement in Ankara.
Absolutely, sure. That's to be studied. Fascinating. I have fragmentary information. There were attempts to, particularly amongst Syrians from the Aleppo region, to ally with Mustafa Kemal, who waged a war for independence, right, rooted in the regions north of Syria against Istanbul. I don't have much evidence of any sustained contact with the government at Istanbul after October 1918. It may exist. I don't know. I am fascinated, however, that there are other historians uncovering the activities of Ottoman Turks in Istanbul who tried to revive the pre-World War I constitutional government after the war. And that history is being written, I think, more richly right now, and we'll have to wait.
I think Adnan Hussein, Professor Hussein, has a question.
Okay.
Hi, thanks so much for a terrific presentation. You were talking a little bit about this Wilsonian influence and importance, and the Paris Peace Conference, and also that there seemed to be a lot of different factions, and Rashid Riddha was sort of between brokering certain things. There seemed to be liberals and other political formations operating in Syria, maybe in other parts of the Arab world. I was wondering, apart from Wilson, was anyone taking inspiration in the Middle East from Lenin, after World War I? And what was the sort of character of maybe some of these more uncompromising positions, that what they were demanding? Was there, any followers of Mir Sultan Galiev, for example, with his sort of Marxist Muslim Islamic socialism orientation?
An amazing, excellent question, and not one that I have found sources to answer fully. My understanding is that communism, particularly in Syria, didn't really emerge until a couple years later, and it was amongst Armenians in particular. There were, eventually it was a Kurd who took over the Syrian Communist Party, so they weren't well organized yet to participate as a group. Not that there might not have been some sentiments of that sort. We know that there were, as early in Iraq, and there, at the same time that Syria is invaded in the summer of 1920, the Iraqis rise up in revolt against a British mandate, right? And that there had been some communist ideas that had entered through there. But I haven't seen anybody that was a bona fide socialist or communist sitting in the Congress of that sort. No. So it was very much a derivative of what the political factions had been before 1914, I think, in Ottoman lands more.
Thanks.
Okay, Hani asks, you just touched on the conflict in Arabia. I think, anyway, he understood it as between the Saudis and the Hashemites. Could you expand on this and what happened in Jordan?
Absolutely. So, this came out of reading portions of Rashid Ridda's diary. Riddha had been involved during World War I in particular in an initiative to get all of the powers in the Arabian Peninsula united. He saw the Arabian Peninsula as the Achilles heel in the Arab world, that would be easily manipulated, divided, and controlled by Europeans unless they were united, and kept urging Faisal throughout the time that Faisal ruled in Syria between October 1918 and through to July 1920 to, convince his father to make peace with Ibn Saud and to unite down there, and to no avail. Faisal did not place that as a priority, wanted to at times think about drawing troops up from Arabia to help him fight the French and so on. But it was a very destabilizing factor. And in fact, the perception that Sharif Hussein was losing power at the expense of the Saudis undermined their position at the Paris Peace Conference, even in in the spring of 1920. The Europeans took note that looked like Sharif Hussein would not be able to send troops up to back up Faisal, and therefore he's easy pickings, if you will. It wouldn't be hard to defeat him, right? So that conflict really did weaken the position of the government in Damascus, no doubt about it. But I think in referring to Jordan, you must be thinking about Faisal's brother Abdullah and the sort of jealousies and rivalries amongst those brothers. I'm not sure if that was part of your question, but after Damascus falls in July of 1920, Abdullah does entertain the possibility of moving into Syria, right? And again, the collusion between the British and the French prevented that from happening.
Do we have some more questions coming in? I think I'd like to conclude with just a question about the geopolitics and the way, the degree to which the people at the Congress were aware of, what was going on in Anatolia and the occupation of Istanbul, and how this might have affected their calculus about what was going on.
Absolutely. They were keeping very close track of what was going on, because they still did. And, interestingly, contrary to received wisdom handed down through the decades, so too did the Turks entertain the possibility of a coalition, right? So the occupation, the willingness to occupy Istanbul was seen as a great danger signal that if the Allies were going to, which they, occupy the Ottoman capital, they weren't going to hesitate to occupy Damascus. That was, seen as a great threat to them. Now, not that that it certainly was not perceived as any great loss in terms of any resources they could have hoped from Istanbul, though. They were not receiving any help from that end, as you might imagine. So,
okay, I think we'll then wrap up here and thank Professor Thompson again for giving this wonderful talk and joining us here in Canada from her home base in Washington, D.C. And we'll close out this talk from another talk from Muslim Society's Global Perspectives. And thank you all for attending.
Thank you so much.
Okay, bye-bye.